All right. Well, hey, it's Rob, and I'm here talking about the Gibson Moderne again. I think this is the third video in as many days as I've made, but the story keeps developing, and I just want to document it, and I think I'm onto something. I think I maybe have some info, at least about the backstory of one specific Gibson Moderne, and you can see it in the thumbnail photo of this video. It is specifically the one that Dan Erlewine ended up with and ended up selling to a businessman in Tokyo. I'm going to tell you, pretty much everything I know about this one guitar, and maybe this will be helpful to anyone doing research or just curious about the history of the Gibson Moderne. Now, of course, the Moderne was one of three they called modernistic guitars that were displayed, I think, at the 1958 NAMM, the music convention, I believe in Chicago, maybe it was in New York. Anyway, they displayed these supposedly three different guitar models, and they were kind of met with, like a shrug of indifference. But, so they ended up making a few Flying V's, which was the most popular of the three designs in 1958 and 59. They made just a handful, maybe 20 Explorers, which was the second design. And the third design, which is now called the Moderne, I don't think it was really called anything back then. Some people called it a sail fin. It kind of looks like half of a Flying V and rounded on the bottom. And they just made a few prototypes, and that was it. They forgot all about this guitar. Now, of course, in hindsight, people started to search for any examples of this guitar that existed, and they've been reissued, and different manufacturers have copied the Gibson Moderne over the years. But as far as originals go, there literally is maybe one that is an original body that came from the factory in Kalamazoo, and this is the one we're talking about today. So I'm just going to run down the whole history on what I know and what I've discovered, maybe about just a part of the timeline of this guitar, and I'll just keep updating as I go. Like I said, maybe this will be helpful to someone in the future researching pretty much the holy grail of solid body guitars. All right, start at the beginning of the story. These Modernes were never really put into production. They made maybe a half a dozen prototype guitars and were either destroyed, left at the factory, given away to factory employees. At, some point a few years down the road, they just, were not around at all to even be viewed by anybody. There were a couple sightings. A couple people saw, a guitar that looked like this in a guitar store. A couple people said they played one briefly, different times, but that was about it. And so where I jump in is I saw a random Facebook comment, and I started to reach out to these two people who claimed that they knew a guy named Jack, and that Jack was a previous owner of what I call the Dan Erlewine Gibson Moderne, because Dan is the most famous person who kind of got his hands on the guitar, worked on the guitar, talks about the guitar, and added to the story of this guitar over the years. Anyway, so to get back to Jack, he was a guy in Detroit, and he made a couple claims over the years. Apparently, he's still around, but he's kind of an antisocial guy and is not easy to contact, or doesn't want to really, go back and discuss anything from the past, according to these two people who I've talked to on Facebook who were friends with them. Anyway, so depending on whatever day it was, and of course, this is a recollection of people from 50 years ago, so who knows how accurate it is. But this guy, Jack, either took the guitar out of the dumpster at Gibson, and, Gibson is in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or they were in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They moved to Memphis, but the old factory is being used by the Heritage Guitar Factory, and they build different versions of the classic Gibson guitars. They are beautiful, very well-made guitars, used with some of the same tooling and the jigs and stuff from the original Gibson factory in Kalamazoo. As a matter of fact, one of the employees of Heritage swears that he went to what he called the Gibson morgue, and he actually took out a Gibson Moderne that he played in a school play in 1963 and then returned it to them, and they wanted to sell it to him for $50 or something, and he didn't want it. So, of course, no photographic evidence exists, but he's one of the few people who swears he had some contact with a Gibson Moderne through the years. Anyway, so the story goes that either story number one from Jack is that he took it out of the dumpster at Gibson, and then he didn't like the neck. They were putting very big, heavy baseball bat necks on these things. They had weird Gumby-shaped headstocks, very big, large, like canoe paddles or whatever. And he didn't like it. He wanted a normal Gibson neck on there. So he returned the guitar to the factory in Kalamazoo. And when he did this, a guy walked out and said, "Hey, I built those guitars. They're super rare. We only made a few of them. And, I will do this, work for you and replace the headstock." It was either broken, like I said, or not to his liking. So they actually replaced the whole neck and put a standard Gibson neck on this Moderne body that he had supposedly taken out of the dumpster. That's story number one. Story number two, and I have a theory as to why there's two stories, is that he got the guitar from a guy named Ralph Cole. I'm trying to track down Ralph Cole. I got as far as his cousin. But apparently Ralph Cole had the guitar sold to this guy named Jack. Now, Ralph Cole is a guitar player from the Detroit area, and he was in a band called The Time, T-H-Y-M-E. They were like a psychedelic band in the late 60s. And then he played in a band called Lighthouse, who were like, I think, a hybrid Canadian-American band. They were like a 10-piece band, like Chicago. They had horns. And so he played in those bands, and that's kind of what he's most famous for. Anyway, Ralph Cole, one of his main guitars was and I don't know if he still owns it, but you can see photos of him. He's got a 50s Flying V. So he obviously is into these kind of modernistic guitars, as they were called. He had an original Flying V, one of maybe 100 made, I assume. And you can see him playing that in a few photos. He was playing it in the mid-60s, and the Flying V was only made in 8 and 59, and then it didn't come out again, I think, till 1966 or 67 when it was reissued. That was the one Hendrix played, and it was a different design. The one Ralph Cole looks like he's playing the pictures looks like one of the original 100 or whatever that were made. So, my theory on this story is that maybe Ralph Cole was the guy that got it from the dumpster at Gibson. A lot of people knew they threw away guitars there all the time, and you could go just pick out parts and make them yourself. Clearly was into these guitars. Matter of fact, I heard that his Flying V came to him in 2 pieces. So it's possible his Flying V was also from the dumpster at Gibson. So my theory, and like I said, I'm just putting it together from what I've heard, is that Ralph Cole pulled this junk Moderne body from Gibson, as he did maybe this Flying V that he got in a couple pieces, and played around with it for a bit, and eventually sold it to this guy named Jack. Now, how do I know any of this stuff? Well, I talked to this Ralph Cole's cousin, and I showed him a picture of the Gibson Moderne, and I said, did he own this guitar? And he said, yeah, he owned this, Flying V guitar that looked just like that, a black Flying V guitar. Now, so few people know what the Moderne is. They think it's a Flying V. They think it's an Explorer, depending on what your experience is. So this guy thinks it's a Flying V. Matter of fact, the 2 people who turned me on to Jack's story, they originally called it a Monster V. So nobody even knew what to call this thing, and officially never really even had a name. It was named after the fact, the Gibson Moderne, but that was after the prototypes had been made, and it could have even been years after that. Eventually, it started to get called something. So, we'll, recap what I said, and then we'll move forward with the story very quickly, and I'll tell you the rest, and I will have the whole story recapped here for you. Possibly this guy, Ralph Cole, who was in the band The Lighthouse and The Time, T-H-Y-M-E, took this Moderne, maybe from the trash at Gibson, maybe, who knows, he got it from somewhere else, messed around with it for a bit, sold it to this guy named Jack. Jack didn't like the neck, or the neck was broken, took it back to Kalamazoo, got the neck replaced, and Jack sold it to this guy, Dan Erlewine, who's a very famous luthier and guitar repair technician. Dan Erlewine had it for a very short amount of time. He looked at it. It was the early 70s. He thought it was an Explorer. So one person thinks it's a Flying V, one person thinks it's an Explorer, but people had so little, information about these guitarists back then, they just may not have known any better. Even an expert like Dan Erlewine, maybe early in his career, didn't even know. So he took what he thought was an Explorer. He said it had an extra route in it. It looked, like it had been damaged or worked on or whatever. He didn't like it or know what to do with it. So he sold it to a store called Ann Arbor Music Mart. So Ann Arbor Music Mart had this guitar again, same thing. They didn't like it. They didn't know what it was or what to do with it. So when they had it up in their shop, a guy who worked for George Gruen, who owns the great guitar store in Nashville, Gruen Guitars, one of the managers from that store happened to come by the Ann Arbor Music Mart, saw the thing, called George Gruen, and described what he had, and George Gruen said, "That sounds like a Gibson Moderne, you should buy it." So he paid $1,000 in 1971 or 72 for it. A lot of money in 72 for a guitar. That's, I don't even know, $10,000 now or more. But a good amount of money for a beat-up old used guitar that had already been messed with. But took the guitar back to Nashville. George Gruen looked at it and said, "I don't know what this is. It's a fake. It's a phony. I don't know. Has the wrong neck on it." I mean, again, they knew so little about these guitars back then that I think they had no reference, point to even, look at it and assess whether it was original or not. Many people, myself included, maybe I'm just being hopeful, think this is probably an original Moderne body that, ended up in the trash at Gibson and somehow made its way through the years, down into the history books. Ann Arbor Music Mart sold it to the guy who worked for George Gruen. George Gruen got rid of it as well. He sold it to a businessman in Tokyo. I'm assuming he made a profit, maybe a nice profit. The businessman in Tokyo had some connection to these guitar stores in Tokyo, in Japan, and put it up in the window and wrote Gibson Moderne on it as the only one that pretty much had ever been seen by anybody. As far as I know, it stood in the window for decades, and while it was there, people from Ibanez came by, looked at it, realized what it was, and they made a copy of it. So they made an exact copy of this one Moderne, which is called the Dan Erlewine Moderne, the black Moderne with a custom white pickguard on it, a unique white pickguard design that's not in any of the Gibson, blueprints or documentation or anything. So clearly it was just made by, individual, some person, and probably just to cover up some of the damage that was on the body. They made a very large pickguard to go on this guitar that wouldn't have originally been there. Now, my other theory, going back to Ralph Cole, is he also made a control panel, a plastic control panel for his Flying V, which apparently he didn't have a pickguard or whatever, or he didn't like the pickguard. I'm not sure what happened. But so my theory is if Ralph Cole knows how to make a plastic panel for his controls on his Flying V, maybe he also made the pickguard on this one Gibson Moderne that is unusual and clearly not made at the factory or whatever. It's a crude looking weird design with shapes on it that don't correspond to the body or anything like that. So those are all the clues that I know right now. The whereabout of the Dan Erlewine Gibson Moderne, the whereabouts are unknown. Used to hang in the guitar store window and has been removed, and who knows where it is now. Probably in the hands of some private collector who maybe knows what he has and is just squirreling it away. If found, this guitar is worth millions of dollars, even just the body alone and an unoriginal neck, because there is no other one out there. So that's all the history I know. I forgot to share the part of the story I learned today. So I'm reaching out to this guy, Ralph Cole, who supposedly owned it at some point, and I got a hold of someone saying that he was his cousin. I asked about the Flying V guitar. He said, yeah, he owned that. He played that in a couple bands, and you can see that in the pictures. There are, of course, as there never are, no pictures of the Moderne, but I showed him a picture of this Moderne, the black Moderne, the Dan Erlewine Moderne. He said, oh yeah, he owned that guitar too. So apparently I've had a couple people verify that this guy, Ralph Cole, the guitar player from the band Lighthouse, at some point owned this suspected Gibson Moderne. Who knows? So as the story develops, I'll come on here and update it, and maybe we'll learn a little bit more, and maybe we'll get some verification at some point that he really did own this guitar. One other piece of information, and I made another video where I actually showed this picture, but I'll just very quickly mention that the two original guys who knew this guy, Jack, who at some point had owned the Gibson Moderne, one of their girlfriends made a drawing of the Moderne, and you can clearly see it's a drawing that was made many decades ago, like with felt pen or something, and it's a drawing of a Gibson Moderne. Now, in 1970, nobody knew what that guitar looked like. Nobody knew the shape. Nobody had seen it. Nobody had any idea. So whatever she was seeing clearly looks like the shape of a Gibson Moderne, and somebody she knew had this guitar. I assume she knew nothing about guitars, and she just drew it, and it looks like a Gibson Moderne. So another piece of the puzzle here, and that's where we're at today. Any more developments, I will certainly update you, but that is the story I know of the history of this, what we're calling the Dan Erlewine Gibson Moderne, the black Moderne made out of Carina wood, I think most likely, and that's been painted black by somebody at some point. I mean, don't forget this guitar was made in 1958. It could have been, purloined from the factory, in the early 60s. It could have bounced around Detroit for 10 years and been messed with and painted, and who knows what's happened to it. But in any case, that's what I know so far. So we'll update as the story develops. Thanks for watching.